Thank you very much, Romain. I was very interested to hear what Jim was saying about the firefighters, and particularly I was very moved when he said about the firefighters during the Second World War who lost their lives, so many of them in London. And if you go to near St Paul's Cathedral, there's a monument, a statue to those firefighters, which I think, if I'm right, was only put up in the last 15 or so years. And that is rather in contrast with the number of statues to the military, to various generals and people who've been involved in these things, which are fill central London. And I think it's a sign of the kind of society that we live in, and particularly the militarisation of the society that we live in, that this is happening, that the people who act so bravely don't get this reward, but the military seem to have rewards for all sorts of things. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to the government, all governments, the Labour government as well, with the question of war. You see, we have now a situation where the war in Afghanistan has been going on for 10 years this October. It has worsened as a war. More people are dying in it now than was the case 10 years ago. And it costs the British government alone £5 billion a year. They launched a war in Libya earlier this year, which every time they fire a cruise missile costs $100 million US. The war in Libya, according to Danny Alexander, will cost by the autumn £1 billion. This isn't even to go into the replacement of Trident, which if you got rid of these wars and Trident, CND and Stop the War have estimated that by the time of the next election in 4 years' time, those two things alone would have cut a third of the deficit that they're talking about. And yet we have a situation where there is a special reserve fund for war. This is how Danny Alexander justifies the bombing of Libya. Yes, we've got a special fund for all that. Why isn't there a special fund to buy back the fire engines which were flogged off a few years ago? Why isn't there a special fund to pay for the hospitals? Why isn't there a special fund to make sure that the people who really need the benefits and welfare, and the people who need pensions, and who were striking about the pensions last week, why isn't there a special fund for all of these things? And we know the reason there isn't a special fund, because the government and the employers and the police and the media are all in cahoots over these questions. We've seen this very clearly this week. The news of the world. It is really one of the biggest political scandals that we can really imagine. That people who bought the police, who bought the government, and I think you have to put it as strongly as this, because this is actually what happened, and it's quite obvious what happened, were the people who also support the wars, attack the strikes, want to break trade unions. Let's just look at the record of Rupert Murdoch, the man who smashed the union at Wapping in 1986, who closed down the unionised papers, the Sunday Times and the Times and the Sun, and moved them to Wapping where there was no union. And the journalists at News of the World are just finding out what that costs when you don't have a union, and many of them are phoning the NUJ to ask what they can do over their job security. Rupert Murdoch was also the man, when the General Belgrano was sunk by Margaret Thatcher in the Falklands War in 1982, that he was the man whose headline of the Sun, when hundreds of people were injured and died, was gotcha. This is the kind of morality of these people. And they were the people who in 2002 and 2003 were the people who were keenest on the war in Iraq. But we know now that only months later they were tapping the phones of the relatives of people who died in that war. This is the morality, not just of the News of the World, but of this government and of the people who are now telling us we all have to make sacrifice while they are getting richer and richer. So when we talk about what we do as the Coalition of Resistance. We have a very big job on our hands. The speakers have spoken about the different issues that are going on. But we should remember the health service is under attack because they prioritise war and privatisation. The pensions are under attack because this is what they are doing. And we have to say that CORE is about campaigning round all these issues. This week, the Greek government, which is supposedly being bailed out again, but at massive cost to the Greek people, this week the Greek government also stopped the flotilla which was sailing from Athens going to Palestine to break the siege of Gaza. These things are all connected. The same people who don't want unions want war and want us to suffer. CORE has to fight on all these fronts, and this is what we are talking about doing. And just one thing, with all the other things that people are talking about, on October the 8th, which is the anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, we're having a mass assembly in Trafalgar Square. We want to get thousands and thousands of people there. And just as we were on the anti-cuts demonstrations last week, the trade union demonstrations last week, we want all the people here today, all their organisations, the trade unions, the campaigns over the health service, all of these, let's all get together and say of all the many things that we have to do, we are going to oppose these wars and oppose this foreign policy because it is a rotten cancer at the heart of this society. We have to end it.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. Thank you very much to all our speakers.